The Austin neighborhood, which Nick calls home, carries within it a serene beauty and a genuine sense of harmony. The green trees cast welcoming shade. The streets are meticulously maintained, adorned with charming houses and lush gardens. Yet beneath this harmonious facade lies an atmosphere of tension, quietly creeping among the residents of this place. The people living in this neighborhood are often preoccupied with their daily lives, but they cannot help but be aware of the strict oversight of the Homeowners Association, HOA. The stringent rules are instituted to preserve the beauty of their neighborhood. But no one can deny that these regulations have become a burden on the life of each resident, although it may seem like a simple life, rich in natural beauty. It has turned into a silent battle between the individual and the collective. Nick, a man in his 30s with a free spirit, always feels constricted within his living space. He loves decorating his house in his own way, showcasing his personality and creativity in every small detail. However, those expressions are suppressed by the absurd rules of the HOA. Want to fly a favorite flag? Not allowed. The color of the house must comply with state regulations. Such nonsense has stirred in Nick a profound frustration. Linda, a woman with lustrous golden hair and a society lady style, embodies the conservatism and rigidity of the HOA. She is the frontline enforcer of those strict regulations, carrying herself with an air of pride and authority. Linda's gaze sharpens whenever she sees a flag flapping in the wind or a fence that doesn't meet the standards. While other residents might avoid conflict, Nick cannot ignore it. He feels that Linda and the HOA's demands are stifling his need for personal freedom, making life suffocating and lifeless. The tension between Nick and Linda is not merely personal. It represents a larger struggle over rights, freedom, and identity. Nick cannot remain idle, and within him, a fierce resolve is forming to challenge the unreasonable constraints imposed by the HOA. He understands that life needs color, not just dry, soulless rules. Thus, Nick decides that he will not easily be subdued. Each warning letter from the HOA only fuels the fire within him, and Nick knows that now is the time to fight for his rights, as well as for all the other residents who quietly endure as he does. Life under the HOA's scrutiny cannot continue forever. It is time for him to reclaim power for himself and his community. Nick, a resident of the Austin neighborhood, feels the harsh constraints imposed by the rules set forth by the HOA, the Homeowners Association, in an area where the lush green of trees blends harmoniously with the soft pastel colors of the houses. This should be an ideal place for people to live and relax. Instead, the friendly atmosphere and peace are stifled by laws enforced under the meticulous supervision of people like Linda, with her shimmering blonde hair and flamboyant style, showcases her pride in her position within the community, but at the same time, she instills a sense of fear in others. Linda is not just a strict overseer, she is a symbol of control, imposing the will of a minority upon the majority. Her presence looms overhead like a dark shadow, constraining the personal freedom of the residents within boundaries she has created. The regulations imposed by the HOA, from the height of fences to the type of grass allowed to be grown, make Nick feel as if he is being severed from freedom every time he receives a warning letter from the HOA. These regulations are not mere guidelines. They feel like invisible chains imprisoning his spirit. He feels suffocated when even hanging a small flag in the front yard is considered a violation. Nick is not only forced to live in the shadow of these rigid regulations, but also to hide his own emotions, something he deeply values. When confronted with Linda in their first meeting, Nick clearly senses the disdain she harbors towards him, her confidence, as she sternly reminds him to adhere to the rules, stirs within him a feeling of oppression Their exchange is not a simple conversation. It becomes a battle over power, pride, and personal freedom. Linda has no intention of listening to or accepting any dissent. With each of her rigid words, she acts as a guardian of the regulations she has established, refusing to allow anyone to challenge her authority. In the months that follow, Nick grapples not only with the perplexing regulations but also with deep disappointment stemming from the ineffectiveness of the law in protecting individual rights. When a call to the police fails to resolve the issue or bring about justice, Nick finds a surge of anger rising within him. He understands that the power of the HOA in this neighborhood has become deeply entrenched and even more potent than the law itself. However, in his darkest moments, Nick refuses to give up. He decides not only to resist, but to create a genuine shockwave against Linda and the current flow of the HOA. Nick begins to form a plan, pouring all his energy into it. He does not merely aim to wage a battle for power. He wants to effect real change for the entire community. Simultaneously, Nick realizes the strength of solidarity among the residents. In clandestine meetings, the stories, experiences, and anxieties of each person gradually come to light. They collectively feel the suffocation wrought by the unreasonable rules. United, they find the resolve and motivation to stand up against the dominance of the HOA and Linda. Change may not happen immediately, but Nick and his neighbors are stronger than ever. Linda's transformation from a domineering figure begins to manifest as the strength of the community steadily grows. With increasingly contradictory actions, Linda feels her control slipping away, further heightening the tension. In this context, more and more residents assert their voices, turning them into an echo that cannot be ignored. Nick understands that this struggle goes beyond merely reclaiming living space. It is a means for everyone to become the agents of their own lives. This moment is the time for all to stand together, creating a powerful voice against the oppression of rigid regulations. This is just the beginning. Linda, with her sleek, golden hair, is not just an ordinary woman in the neighborhood. She is a symbol of the strict and unwavering authority of the Homeowners Association, HOA. With her society lady, fashion sense, and icy gaze, she keeps everyone around her on edge. The stringent rules set forth by the HOA have seemingly become an indispensable part of daily life for the residents of Austin. Yet Linda is the one who enforces these regulations with a sternness that brooks no dissent. In the eyes of the residents, Linda is not simply a supervisor. She is someone capable of controlling their lives. Her actions, from conducting surprise inspections to sending warning letters about minor offenses, like the inappropriate color of fences, have created a heavy atmosphere in the neighborhood. She is akin to a stern gatekeeper, always present to uphold the prescribed rules, indifferent to the feelings of those who live around her. When Nick decides to challenge the oppression imposed by the HOA, he soon realizes that the struggle is not his alone. Beneath Linda's strong and confident exterior lies a fragile individual, constantly afraid of losing the power she wields. Nick feels both anger and pity when he contemplates her loneliness. The more he observes Linda's manipulation, the more he recognizes that behind every rigid command lies a profound emotional void and a lack of empathy. The warning letters that go out serve as reminders of the power Linda possesses, but they also reflect the insecurities she endures. She is not merely fighting to maintain control, but also to mask the emptiness in her personal life. When the encounter between Nick and Linda takes place, the tension is palpable, as Nick perceives Linda not only as an enforcer of regulations but also as a victim of the very control she has established. Nick understands that opposing the power of the HOA is not just about creating confrontations or causing disturbances. It's also about finding Linda's vulnerabilities to awaken in her an awareness of community solidarity and rights. He decides he is not alone in this battle but will cultivate like-minded spirits within the neighborhood, transforming this into a powerful movement. As Nick begins to approach his neighbors, he finds that many of them are experiencing similar pressures under Linda's shadow. They share stories of surprise inspections, letters that stifle personal freedom, and the anxiety of failing to comply with absurd rules. This camaraderie and sharing allow Nick to perceive the strength of the community, fostering an unprecedented sense of unity in the neighborhood. In meeting his neighbors, Nick inspires them not only with words, but also through his patience and determination. The oppressive atmosphere that Linda has created had closed individuals off from one another. But as people realize they are not alone, fear begins to dissipate, yielding to confidence and a will to rise. During secret meetings, Nick and the residents strategize their next actions. They not only seek to fight for personal rights, but also aim to remind Linda that so-called rules require flexibility and empathy. Through this, they establish a new strength, a collective ready to voice its dissent against the unfair decisions imposed by Linda. The image of Linda, with her rigidity and coldness, begins to appear in a new light. It is predicted that Nick's and the residents' struggle will not only shake her position, but also open a doorway to change. The Austin neighborhood may not be perfect, but it will no longer be a place where the HOA's power dictates the lives of each individual. Change has begun, and Nick, alongside his friends, will be the pioneers in overturning the status quo. Nick began to keenly feel the discomfort arising from the stringent regulations set by the HOA. The stringent rules imposed by this organization were not merely prohibitions. They had seemingly become obstacles in his everyday life, like invisible shadows. They made life under Nick's roof stifling, akin to a tight garment constricting around his body, making each breath increasingly difficult. The fence surrounding his house, originally constructed to protect his private space, had now become a focal point for HOA patrols. According to regulations, the fence was only allowed to be 1 meter high, a height that Nick often felt was insufficient to ensure the privacy he required. The gazes from outside were not just penetrating looks but also carried whispers and scrutiny from the surrounding residents. Amid peaceful green surroundings, these unreasonable rules stood out like scars, ruining the beauty of the small neighborhood where he lived. Moreover, the HOA's regulations regarding the type of grass planted in the garden further frustrated Nick. He preferred a yard filled with plants of his choice, but the HOA's guidelines forced him to adhere to rigid standards. Only specific types of grass were permitted, and violators would receive warning letters, threatening heavy fines for continued infractions. These letters not only pressured him but also made Nick feel as though he was living under a state regime rather than a tight-knit community. This situation gradually became a psychological burden for him. From the very first days after moving here, Nick had envisioned this neighborhood as a place where he could build a peaceful life, yet now, all he received in return was tension, mental conflicts, and the frustration of not being able to follow his personal preferences. Every morning, he awakened anxious about the absurd rules that the HOA might impose next. That discomfort seeped into all aspects of his life, causing simple joys to lose their sweetness. One time, Nick decided to invite a few friends over. He tried to create a cheerful and relaxed atmosphere, but the conversation quickly turned to the confusing regulations imposed by the HOA. His friends couldn't help but shake their heads in dismay at the realities that Nick faced. They shared similar stories, which only deepened Nick's despondence. While he felt he was not alone in this struggle, he still had no idea how to bring about change. The warning letters, the pressure from Linda's every remark, and the unrelenting surveillance had become part of Nick's daily existence. This, not only constrained the things he loved, but also made him feel as though his self-worth was being undermined. Nick was now not only fighting for personal freedom, but felt as if he was also battling to defend a part of himself against a system he could not control. A sense of helplessness began to take root in Nick's mind, yet a part of him still longed for change. Day by day, the question loomed in his mind, could a single individual truly make a difference in a community? Or did each individual need to stand together to confront the injustices they were enduring? Nick was determined not to let this oppression continue any longer. Somehow, he would have to find a way to drive change. The meeting between Nick and Linda took place in a tense atmosphere. The scrutinizing gazes of other residents in the community gathered around the HOA meeting room, adding to the oppressive heat. Nick felt the rhythmic pounding of his heart, each beat resounding like a drum, awakening the patience within him. Linda, embodying an air of haughty elegance with her meticulously styled blonde hair, stood before the rows of seats, wielding the strength of someone who holds power, arrogant and inflexible. Nick could not accept being subjected to unreasonable rules without justification. He was ready for this fight, not only for himself but also for the other residents who were suffering under the shadow of the domination that Linda represented. Linda began the exchange with an icy tone, her arrogance apparent. "Nick, you need to understand that these regulations are in place to protect the value of our properties and our living environment. We cannot allow everyone to feel comfortable doing whatever they want without limits." Nick could hardly believe what he was hearing. "But Linda," he firmly replied, feeling a swell of anger rising. "Personal freedom is also a part of our living environment. I want to know why everything we do has to be dictated by these ridiculous rules. Why can't we decorate our homes with the colors we love?" Nick's defiance seemed only to make Linda more resolute. She had no intention of entertaining arguments. Convinced that her authority was unassailable, personal freedom cannot be an excuse to damage the beauty of this neighborhood. If everyone did as they pleased, it would turn this neighborhood into a chaotic mess. We need order. Linda spat out her words, persuasive but dry. Lacking in empathy, the conversation became a battle between reason and belief. Nick felt shame rise within him as he confronted a woman who held no respect for his opinions. "Linda," he said, his tone calm yet determined, "beauty lies not just within the rules we follow, but in how we express ourselves, creating a living space that truly reflects who we are. I don't want this neighborhood to become a dull place where everyone must live according to a soulless mold." Linda merely shook her head, once again demonstrating her inflexibility. "I think you need to reconsider. Nick, we cannot let individual opinions harm the overall appearance of this neighborhood." This clash was not merely a confrontation between Nick and Linda, but a struggle representing what the residents yearned for a voice. Nick could not give up. He realized he had touched upon something deeper than individual concerns. It was about freedom, fairness, and community. As the debate continued, Nick suddenly sensed some residents beginning to stand up, forming a wave of support for him. "We feel the same as Nick." One neighbor spoke up. "We don't want to live in fear and anxiety, worrying about every trivial detail regarding rules. We want the freedom to decide for ourselves." Linda gradually recognized that what she had been defending was not truly an ideal, but merely rigid control. She began to feel loneliness as the hopeful gaze she held as the HOA representative began to fade. The encouragement from the residents made it impossible for her to maintain her stoic facade any longer. The confrontation slowly transformed from a battle between two individuals into a struggle for the entire community. Nick realized that even though he felt a sense of victory within, this journey was not just his alone, but also for all those who had always remained hidden behind feelings of helplessness. As the discussion drew to a close, an informal consensus began to form. Everyone felt they could no longer live under the pressure from a single individual. This struggle wasn't just about Nick and Linda. It served as a reminder that a community is always stronger when standing together to overcome invisible barriers. Nick left the meeting room filled with a newfound determination. The battle had just begun, and he knew that those around him were increasingly recognizing their own strength. There was no longer any reason to be afraid of a rigid woman like Linda. Together, they had sparked a movement, not just for personal lives, but for the future of the entire neighborhood. Life in the Austin neighborhood, while seemingly peaceful, harbors hidden tensions that are far from easy to detect. Anyone residing here is well aware of the stifling feeling that accompanies the strict regulations imposed by the Homeowners Association HOA, constantly followed and monitored by Linda, the HOA representative. Nick feels his life is controlled like a puppet. Warning letters about fences exceeding height regulations or the improper color of flower beds leave him feeling cornered. His spirit weighed down when yet another letter slammed against Nick's door. He could only sigh, a sense of despondency washing over him. The words in the letter, seemingly penned by an emotionless robot, persistently reminded him of his non-compliance with the HOA's established rules. He wondered why a community felt the need for such rigid regulations. Why couldn't people freely express themselves and their living spaces? The pressure stemmed not only from the ceaseless stream of letters but also from Linda's looming presence. She was like a shadow, ever ready to pounce on any sign of rule-breaking. With her glossy blonde hair and sophisticated style, Linda made a strong impression. But behind that exterior lurked a cold and sharp soul, always prepared to wield her authority to impose her views, leaving many residents feeling threatened. Nick couldn't contain his anger each time he faced her. In a moment of lost restraint, he decided to confront Linda directly about the absurdity of the regulations. The humiliation and frustration within him erupted during that exchange. Why do you need to interfere in how we live? What gives you the right to decide for us? Nick asked bluntly. Linda raised an eyebrow. A clear display of disdain etched across her face. I'm simply safeguarding the value of this neighborhood. Nick, if everyone lives however they please, what will keep us united? These regulations are essential for maintaining order and harmony, she replied coldly, leaving no room for debate. The conversation between Nick and Linda was not merely an exchange of views. It was a battle between reasoning and dogma. Nick felt the weight of his own powerless struggles. His words seemed like waves crashing against the solid wall that was Linda, unable to penetrate. Leaving that encounter, Nick couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of frustration that engulfed him. It felt like a dark shadow overshadowing every hope he had for freedom and autonomy. Reflecting on that confrontation, he began to feel a deep disappointment in the system he had once trusted. The HOA's power, channeled through Linda, was not just dictated by the ink on paper or codes of conduct. It felt like a part of the very air everyone breathed, deeply embedded in every facet of life, nearly impossible to eliminate. This sense of helplessness pushed Nick to seek a solution. He didn't just want to address his personal troubles, but sought to expand the scope to encompass all residents of the neighborhood. An intimate trend began to take shape in his mind for change to occur. They needed more than one person, they needed to be a community. That thought began to outline a plan in Nick's mind. He needed a strategy that was not just theoretical, but feasible and supported by others. This would require not only intelligence, but also patience and determination. Above all, Nick understood that they had to unite, standing together against the oppression represented by Linda, so that none of them would feel alone in this fight. Life in the neighborhood was not merely about existing in a space. It was a struggle to reclaim the right to what belonged to them. He, a part of a vibrant community, was ready for the journey of fighting, not just for himself, but for everyone. Nick sat in the corner of the garden, the gentle golden sunlight streaming down onto each vibrant green leaf. However, his mind was preoccupied with a plan that he hoped would disrupt the gloomy world created by the HOA. He could no longer allow Linda, who represented oppression, to continue controlling his life and that of his neighbors. Nick decided it was time to act in a more clever and nuanced manner. In the following days, Nick began gathering information. He attended HOA meetings, quietly listening to the new regulations proposed by Linda and others. Each time, Linda made a new suggestion, seemingly absurd and unnecessary. Nick took notes. He wanted evidence to refute these misguided viewpoints. Every time he encountered Linda during the meetings, his self-esteem was put to the test again. But now he no longer felt humiliated or powerless. Instead, Nick felt as though he was preparing for a real battle. Nick began to form a strategic plan. And indeed, it was not merely a game. He viewed everything through a psychological lens. Linda of the HOA was not just a control freak, but someone hiding deep-seated fears, the fear of losing power, the fear of criticism, and the fear that she would no longer be in charge when many residents united against her. Nick resolved to turn those fears to his advantage. First, he decided to approach each neighbor individually. Nick skillfully built trust through intimate conversations where they shared their anxieties about the HOA's rules. They felt as if they had been oppressed for too long without daring to speak up. Through each conversation, Nick conveyed a message the discontent was not just his own, but belonged to everyone. He encouraged them to join this fight and collectively voice their concerns. Each meeting Nick organized was meticulously prepared. He not only outlined the issues created by the HOA, but also proposed concrete solutions. He called on everyone to collaborate in creating an alternative proposal for the HOA, a plan based not only on rigid regulations, but also on interaction, addressing the needs and rights of all. Nick also emphasized delivering his message with subtle finesse. Instead of directly attacking Linda, he always used very polite language, stressing that everyone deserved to be heard and respected. We are not rebels opposing the rules, but citizens asking for the opportunity to build a better community together. Nick emphasized during the meetings. Danny, a neighbor who had always been skeptical about collective strength, stood up when Nick presented his ideas. If we work together, we can create a voice strong enough to change everything, he said. These words created an atmosphere of excitement and unity within the community. Eventually, as the secret meetings attracted a growing number of participants, Nick sensed a significant shift in their mindset. They no longer confined themselves to the rules, but began to realize that they had the right to shape their own future. Relationships grew stronger, and individual confidence was restored. Nick believed that once the community was united, his plan would not only be a shock to Linda, but also a catalyst for everyone to realize the power of solidarity. And while Linda might feel increasingly anxious, her position would be transformed by the very people she had once ridiculed and disdained. The psychological game Nick had plotted was now not just his battle, but a collective journey of the entire community, where everyone joined hands and stood up for their rights. When Nick realized that the dissatisfaction and pressures from the HOA were not just personal issues but also affected the entire community, he came up with a bigger idea. Struggling alone was not enough. A true victory would only be achieved when everyone joined forces, collectively striving toward a common goal. In this spirit, Nick began to communicate carefully and skillfully with his neighbors. He organized small gatherings where everyone could freely share the troubles they faced due to the HOA's regulations. The meetings took place in a warm atmosphere, filled with closeness and trust. The nearby small park became the perfect choice, where laughter and stories could be shared openly, away from the watchful eyes of Linda and the HOA members. Each story told, from the inability to fly family flags to minor conflicts in lawn care, painted a vivid picture of the common pressure that each resident faced. Nick listened and understood, realizing that none of them were alone. All were living together in a home with narrow walls and cumbersome rules. Through these gatherings, a sense of empathy gradually formed, becoming the motivation for the group. They began to feel that silently enduring was not the solution. At times, strength does not come from mighty armies but from the unity of quiet, yet resilient voices. This infused them with a new energy. Residents from all over the neighborhood began to sit together, discussing strategies and exploring ways to combat the oppression from the HOA. As solidarity slowly developed, they decided to organize a peaceful protest at the next HOA meeting. Gone were the whispers and fears, replaced instead by determined and confident gazes from the neighbors. Nick stood up to speak, urging everyone to unite and give voice to themselves, to stand against the oppressive regulations that so many had suffered under for far too long. We are not just individuals existing in a neighborhood, we are strength. We are community. If we do not stand up, we will become victims of resistance. Let us show Linda that we are not afraid and that it is time for these rules to change, Nick declared passionately. After the secret meetings were held, Nick and his neighbors decided to take a bolder step. They prepared a letter requesting changes to the legal regulations, outlining the points that each resident felt were unfair. Everyone signed their names together, expressing solidarity not only in words but also in actions. Though the battle ahead was fraught with challenges, the connection among the people created an unprecedented strength. Nick felt he was no longer alone in this fight. Behind him was an entire community, united by a shared ideal and determination for reform. They may not have the power that Linda wielded, but with their numbers and resolve, they could create a wave strong enough to change the dynamics of the neighborhood. In each meeting, they not only sought solutions but also shared their inner strength. Their faith in themselves and in one another grew day by day. Nick realized that each person had their own story, and when these stories piled on top of each other, they formed an unstoppable force. With the mutual support, they began to dismantle the mental barriers that the HOA had erected. And during the dark nights, when the streetlights reflected the thick shadows of the trees, the residents of Austin's neighborhood were not just dreaming of change, they were taking real action. Each prolonged gathering was not just a neighborhood meeting but a small revolution, where everyone sought the light at the end of the tunnel. And despite the pressures from the HOA, they were ready to stand up and create a future that they truly deserved. Linda had always been a model of control. She bore the responsibilities of the HOA not only through her position but also through her personality. Her strictness had created a solid wall between her and the residents, growing thicker with each passing day. Yet, perhaps the worries within her were gradually transforming into a storm. Recently, Linda felt that she was losing control of the situation. HOA meetings had become increasingly tense, with many members openly expressing their dissatisfaction with the rules she imposed. The once peaceful neighborhood had now turned into an underground battlefield, where each glance became a weapon, and every word was a bullet. Linda began to notice a change among the residents. Those she had once regarded as foolish and easily managed were now connecting with each other, more united than ever. The secret meetings that Nick organized had become not only a space for sharing sentiments, but also a powerful source of motivation. They found in one another the strength, unity, and a common ideal, the desire to live in a free space, unchained by unreasonable rules. One afternoon, while strolling around the neighborhood, Linda saw a group of residents gathered outside one of the houses. They were discussing not just grass or fences, but also sharing their desires, what they truly deserved in their living spaces. She couldn't help but feel a pang of realization that each of them had their own unique stories and strong aspirations. From being individuals under control, they had now transformed into warriors ready to stand up for their rights. Linda returned home with mixed emotions. She switched on the light and sat in front of the mirror, questioning whether it was truly necessary to maintain this power. The images of her neighbors, their smiles, and their determination made her heart race. She began to wonder, what has happened to myself, to the person I once was? A few nights later, unable to sleep due to a whirlwind of thoughts in her head, Linda experimented with small changes in her behavior. She started to listen more, allowing residents' genuine opinions to be expressed without immediate rebuttals. The inner turmoil she had felt gradually transformed into gratitude for the criticisms and resistance she had once deemed threatening. Linda's initial actions, though small, elicited strong responses. The residents felt the change. They realized that their voices were being heard, and they no longer felt oppressed. However, within Linda, everything was not yet resolved. She harbored a deep-seated anxiety about this position, about revealing the imperfections within herself. One afternoon, when all the residents gathered for an extraordinary HOA meeting, Linda decided to shed the protective armor she had always worn. She entered the meeting room, where every face was bright with the determination to fight, and uttered the first words that would likely mark a shift in how everyone perceived her. "I have not been perfect. I imposed rules that I never considered could harm you." Those words struck like arrows into the hearts of the residents. They whispered, exchanging glances, unable to believe what they had just heard. Somewhere in Linda's mind, she accepted that this was not just a lesson for herself, but also an opportunity to prove that individual pieces could create a beautiful picture when brought together. She continued, her voice growing more confident. "We all have the right to decide how we live our lives. I had forgotten that. I apologize for not giving you the chance to express your feelings and opinions. I want to listen. And from here, we can change together." Tears fell. Faces lit up, and applause erupted. Linda realized that she had not only regained respect, but had also found inspiration in the residents who had long endured her control. Linda's transformation did not end with her words of apology. She understood that true change required time and effort. She called for a meeting for everyone to collectively determine which rules were necessary and which had become outdated. This was the turning point that the entire Austin neighborhood had been waiting for. They no longer felt like slaves within a system. Linda had become a part of them, not as a servant, but as a member of the community, a collaborator. Through her actions and attitudes, Linda began to rebuild the bridge between herself and the residents, as every voice was respected. The struggle was no longer between Nick and Linda. It had now become a shared battle for a brighter future for the entire neighborhood, overcoming the barriers of paradoxes and drawing closer with each order of empathetic and understanding voices. In the tranquil ambiance of the Austin neighborhood, the air was thick with complex emotions. The HOA meeting that Nick had long prepared for was drawing near, and the excitement within him surged like a relentless wave. Other residents were gathering in the common area, where the atmosphere felt tense. Nick could sense the anxiety in the glances and whispered conversations of his neighbors, but he also perceived their determination to rise against oppression. Linda, with her haughty and stern demeanor, arrived late. She entered with an air of self-satisfaction, her face showing no surprise at the large gathering of residents. The sense of pride emanating from her created a barrier between herself and those she had controlled for so long. Upon meeting Nick's expectant and defiant gaze, Linda could not conceal her discomfort. This was no ordinary meeting, it was a decisive battle. The room fell silent, awaiting the moment. But Nick knew that this was the time for him to speak up. Taking a deep breath, he stood up and began to speak with a confident yet heavy tone. "We are all here today because we want to protect our own interests. None of us is a loser. And what Linda imposes upon us are not mere strict regulations, but a disrespectful perspective toward personal freedom." A few residents applauded in encouragement. The dim light from the ceiling fixture seemed to illuminate their spirits. Nick continued, "We can no longer accept the injustices imposed by Linda and the HOA. We do not merely live in a neighborhood, we exist as a community. If we allow tyranny to continue dominating our lives, we will be no different from slaves to unreasonable regulations." Linda attempted to interrupt, but Nick was prepared for her resistance. "I did not come here to listen to unconvincing excuses. I came here to stand up alongside everyone else to defend our rights. We have endured enough warning letters, unreasonable punishments, and the expulsion by someone who believes they hold power." Nick's words resonated, persuasive and fervent, igniting enthusiasm among the other residents. As Nick recounted personal stories, memories of hanging flags on holidays or tending to gardens in his own way, only to be disregarded, the empathy from the community became apparent. They had collectively endured the fragments of a controlled life, and now was the time to unite. Quiet chants from the back, nods of agreement, gradually transformed into applause and relieved sighs. The confrontation between Nick and Linda grew more chaotic as Nick urged people to voice their concerns. A shy neighbor, finally gathering courage, stood up to share her story. "I was punished for the height of my fence. It was just a few centimeters. But to Linda, it became a reason to send me warning letters." The atmosphere became livelier as each person took turns sharing their struggles. Another complained about flower colors in their garden not complying with regulations, lamenting the loss of personal preference due to one person's rules. Linda, realizing she was at a disadvantage, tried to maintain her composure but appeared flustered. She stood up, facing the residents, but the strength of Nick's confidence proved too formidable, rendering her words unconvincing. "I don't need to listen to your excuses," Linda retorted, but her anger invigorated the residents. They were no longer the scared victims of a power-hungry individual. Nick recognized that this was a crucial moment to transform their belief into concrete action. He decided to propose a clear idea. "Why don't we organize a referendum? Every resident here has the right to express their opinion about the existence of the HOA. We are not just demanding basic rights. We are demanding the right to live and thrive in a community where every individual is respected." The atmosphere was charged with agreement and excitement. People began conversing, exchanging ideas, realizing their collective strength as they acted together. A wave of approval turned into a lively discussion among hundreds. Linda, now losing control, appeared tense and confused. The tactics that once worked no longer had an effect, and Nick had demonstrated that unity was the key to resisting tyranny. When the meeting concluded, not only was there a clear plan for action, but there was also a newfound source of inspiration for the community. As people left, they walked away with stronger breaths, brighter smiles, and a sense of satisfaction for having reclaimed their voices. Nick silently hoped that this was just the beginning of a larger battle, a struggle for freedom, respect, and rightful claims for every member of the community. When life in the Austin neighborhood grew increasingly tense under the control of the HOA, Nick decided it was time to take action. He knew that the greatest strength did not solely lie in the hands of individuals, but also in the unity of the entire community. With the support of his neighbors, Nick began to formulate a plan for a referendum to reconsider the existence of the HOA. The residents had become so accustomed to living under the stringent regulations of the HOA that they had almost forgotten they had the right to voice their opinions. Nick hoped that this referendum would open up an opportunity for everyone to express their views and feelings about the constraints imposed by the HOA. He began to invite his neighbors to participate in this event, organizing small meetings to discuss, share emotions, and explore how the HOA had impacted their lives. At these meetings, people took turns sharing personal stories, from the inability to decorate their gardens as they wished to the troubles encountered when needing to repair their homes without adhering to the strict regulations. As more people joined this movement, Nick felt the power of unity. The meetings were filled with an atmosphere of enthusiasm and lively discussion. They began to realize they were not alone in this fight. They were, in fact, a strong community with voices that needed to be heard. The feeling of pity for their fate gradually transformed into pride in their community, and their solidarity formed a force that could not be ignored. Nick prepared for a large HOA meeting, where he would announce the results of the referendum. It would be a moment when residents could stand up and express their will without fear of Elinda's oppression. Before the meeting, Nick listened closely to every feedback from his neighbors, taking notes so he could present clear and persuasive arguments when necessary. He invited those who wished to speak up, helping everyone feel that their opinions were valued. Finally, the momentous day arrived. Nick organized a large gathering in the neighborhood park. People came together to discuss and prepare for the meeting with the HOA. Gone were the timid glances and forced smiles that hid discontent. Instead, the eyes of the residents now reflected determination and latent strength. They were no longer individuals but a solid block of unity, ready to demand their rights. As the meeting commenced, the atmosphere was indeed tense. Nick began his speech, his voice sincere and full of emotion. He spoke not only about the HOA's regulations, but also about the feelings and dreams of each person in the community. He reminisced about cherished memories, the backyard barbecues, and family gatherings that the HOA had unintentionally dampened, emphasizing that life in the neighborhood should be vibrant and free. When Nick presented his views on the referendum, the room erupted into noise. Supportive cheers from the residents spread throughout, creating an animated atmosphere. They demanded not just a critique of the rules, but also a desire for a freer living environment where everyone's opinion mattered. One by one, individuals stood up to speak, their personal stories gradually weaving together into a larger tapestry of respect and sharing within the community. As the meeting concluded, the residents cast their votes regarding the existence of the HOA. Although the results would not be announced immediately, their hearts were filled with hope. They felt the power of speaking out and of uniting against unreasonable constraints. Regardless of the outcome, Nick had succeeded in awakening the spirit of community, encouraging everyone to fight for their voices. What mattered was not just the vote, but that they had listened to and understood the power of unity, a community where every opinion was respected, where the dreams and desires of each individual were acknowledged. As they left the meeting, not only would the light shine brighter, but the pride of each resident would also be stronger than ever. This battle may not yet be over, but the faith and determination in their hearts had been renewed, heralding a new beginning for everyone in the Austin neighborhood. The final battle has gradually come to an end, but it is not merely the conclusion of a crisis in the Austin neighborhood. It stands as a milestone, a profound lesson about power and solidarity among the residents. Nick, with his passion and tireless efforts, has opened a new path for those living in the area, a path that no longer suffocates them under the stringent regulations and personal opinions of any one individual. but rather creates a living space where everyone has a voice. The referendum was held in a tense atmosphere. Each resident understood the importance of this event, not only because they wanted to change the HOA, but also because they felt as though they had nearly lost themselves under Linda's watchful eye. The warning letters, the secret meetings, and the rage that had been buried deep within them were now unleashed. On that day, each person clearly expressed their will. They were not just voting on the existence of the HOA, they were also seizing the opportunity to assert their voices. As the lights in the hall began to dim, all eyes turned to Nick. He stepped up to the podium with a heavy heart but filled with determination. "We are not just neighbors, we are a community," Nick said, his voice resonating clearly. "Each of us deserves to live in a space where we feel free." The strict regulations of the HOA not only stifle the creativity in our lives, but also distance us from the familiarity we once had. The emotion from Nick's speech acted like a refreshing breeze that revitalized each resident's spirit. They realized that what Nick was saying was not just a personal battle, it was the struggle of all of them. Their eyes began to shine with a renewed sense of hope. They were no longer alone. They had found strength in one another. Linda, standing beside them with an utterly incredulous expression, seemed unable to comprehend the power of solidarity. She, who had once held supreme power in her hands, now felt uneasy. The smugness she always carried was replaced with anxiety. This feeling unsettled Linda, and the question that haunted her was, could she maintain her power while the residents had united as the voting took place? The residents found motivation from deep within their hearts. They not only stood together but also dared to confront the worries and fears of potentially losing personal privileges in the community. Moments later, the results were announced. The vote against the HOA was overwhelming. Joy erupted, and they embraced each other in excitement. It was as if everyone felt they had just lifted a heavy burden, not just materially but spiritually as well. The exhilaration of unity not only satisfied Nick but also contributed to changing the entire community. Subsequent meetings no longer propagated unreasonable regulations, but shifted towards beautifying the neighborhood and organizing activities that bonded the community. They hosted BBQ parties, weekend gatherings, and, at the very least, discovered joy in cohabitation. Linda, on her way home, could not accept the reality that everything had changed. She recognized that the rules she once enforced no longer had power in a community that had found its own voice. Her life, once filled with value, now felt diminished, forcing her to confront the harsh truth her authority was based on fear, not respect. As time passed, Nick consistently reaffirmed that individual freedom is essential in any community. Life is not solely about regulations, but also about mutual respect and the freedom of choice. He understood that, at times, battles for personal and communal rights must naturally occur. This was not just one individual's fight, but rather a gift of solidarity created by all. The story of the Austin neighborhood not only reflected injustices but also awakened fundamental human values. Through this, each resident recognized that the strength of solidarity not only helped them overcome challenges but also enriched their lives. They shone together like lights in the night, not only illuminating one another but also guiding future generations to never forget that the rights of individuals and communities must always be protected, and that the power of unity can transform the constricted confines of life.